The 5-year secret. When screenshots shattered the perfect image. The notification appeared on a Thursday afternoon, ordinary in every way except for what it was about to unleash. A single post from an unknown account, containing words that would detonate 5 years of carefully maintained secrets and force thousands of people to reconsider everything they thought they knew about a relationship they'd watched unfold on their screens. The post was simple, direct, and devastating. She'd been in an on and off relationship with him for half a decade, running parallel to his very public life with Shannon, and she had the receipts to prove every word. Within hours, the internet would be ablaze with speculation, defense, and demands for proof. Within days, that proof would emerge in waves so comprehensive and damning that denial would become impossible. This is the story of how a double life maintained in the shadows finally exploded into public view, how one woman's decision to stop protecting a liar's reputation changed everything, and how the gap between carefully curated public personas and messy private reality became impossible to ignore. But before we dive into the evidence that's currently tearing through social media like wildfire, before we examine the timeline and the receipts and the devastating implications, we need to understand something crucial. This isn't just another celebrity cheating scandal or reality TV drama manufactured for ratings. This is a documented case of sustained deception involving real people, real children, and real consequences that will echo for years. And the woman at the center of the revelation isn't seeking fame or money or revenge in any traditional sense. She simply decided, after 5 years of existing in the shadows of someone else's lies, that her own integrity matters more than protecting his secrets. Shannon's life has been public currency since childhood, documented on reality television as she navigated family chaos, personal growth, and the transition from troubled teenager to mother trying to build stability. Viewers watched her relationship with Josh develop over the years, rooting for what seemed like a genuine partnership amid all the dysfunction that surrounded them. They appeared to complement each other, building a blended family with 4 children, weathering the storms that come with life in the public eye, presenting a united front against whatever challenges emerged. Social media showed birthday celebrations, family milestones, declarations of commitment and love. Episodes featured their home life, their parenting approach, their efforts to create something solid despite rocky foundations. It felt authentic in the way that reality television rarely does. Like maybe this was actually a success story, a relationship that worked despite the odds. Fans invested emotionally in their narrative, defending them in comment sections, celebrating their wins, sympathizing with their struggles. The relationship became part of Shannon's brand, her identity, her story arc, and all of it, every single moment captured on camera and shared online, was happening while another woman waited in the background, receiving messages and promises that directly contradicted everything the public was seeing. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that dual reality is staggering when you really consider it. To film scenes about trust and partnership while actively deceiving your partner. To post loving tributes while texting someone else romantic messages. To look into cameras and present one version of your life while living something entirely different the moment filming stopped. The ex-girlfriend's emergence into public consciousness wasn't dramatic initially, just a name starting to appear in comment sections and private groups, vague enough that casual observers wouldn't notice, but specific enough that people paying close attention started asking questions. There were whispers before the explosion, breadcrumbs that only became visible in retrospect, a deleted comment here, a screenshot shared in a private Facebook group there, rumors that seemed too specific to be completely fabricated, but too explosive to believe without proof. Then the posts that changed everything, the moment she decided that silence was no longer an option, and that whatever consequences came from speaking up were preferable to continuing to carry the weight of someone else's deception. Her statement was measured and specific. She'd been involved with him on and off for 5 years, maintaining a relationship that overlapped significantly with his public commitment to Shannon, and she had documentation to prove it. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Shannon's supporters came out swinging, calling her a liar, a clout chaser, someone bitter and seeking attention by trying to destroy a family. They demanded proof, certain that none could exist, that this was just another jealous ex trying to cause problems. What they didn't anticipate was that she'd spent 5 years collecting that proof, screenshotting conversations, saving messages, documenting a relationship that she perhaps always knew might require evidence to be believed. The receipts started dropping within hours, and each new release made the denials harder to maintain. The evidence wasn't vague or easily dismissed. We're talking about time-stamped text conversations spanning multiple years, showing consistent communication patterns that clearly indicated an ongoing relationship rather than occasional contact between old friends. The messages contained pet names, inside jokes, references to shared experiences, and discussions of a future together that directly contradicted the future he was supposedly building with Shannon. There were photos with metadata intact, showing dates and locations that could be cross-referenced with his public whereabouts and social media posts, revealing discrepancies between where he claimed to be and where he actually was. Video messages captured his voice, his face, his expressions, as he said things to her that no one in a committed relationship should be saying to someone else. Financial records showed transactions between them, Venmo payments, and Cash App transfers that told their own story about the nature and frequency of their contact. And perhaps most damning were the screenshots of conversations that occurred during periods when his relationship with Shannon appeared strongest, after public declarations of commitment, during family vacations that were documented on social media, even around holidays that he'd apparently spent messaging another woman while presenting himself as a devoted family man. The metadata on these images could be verified by anyone with basic technical knowledge, making claims of fabrication or Photoshop manipulation essentially impossible. This wasn't someone with a few old texts from years ago trying to cause trouble. This was comprehensive documentation of a sustained relationship, maintained deliberately and with considerable effort over half a decade. When you lay out the timeline chronologically, patterns emerge that transform isolated incidents into a coherent narrative of calculated deception. 5 years ago, according to the ex-girlfriend's account, they first connected. The exact circumstances of that initial meeting remain somewhat unclear, and we should be transparent about separating confirmed facts from assumptions. But what's documented is that communication began and quickly became more than casual. Early messages show a friendship developing, conversations about daily life, and personal struggles. Nothing that would immediately scream inappropriate to an outside observer. But there's something that becomes apparent when you read these exchanges in sequence. The timing is consistently suspicious, messages sent late at night when someone should presumably be focused on their home life, conversations happening during periods that coincide with documented absences, or unexplained time away from the primary relationship. As months progressed, the messages became increasingly intimate, crossing the line from friendship into territory that was undeniably romantic. Expressions of feelings that went beyond platonic care, discussions of what they meant to each other, frustration about the circumstances that kept them from being together openly. Then there would be gaps, sometimes weeks, occasionally months of minimal or no contact visible in the records. These periods of silence often coincided with visible stability in the public relationship, times when Shannon and Josh appeared particularly solid on social media, when family content was being posted regularly, when everything seemed fine, but then the communication would resume, often triggered by some visible conflict or stress in the primary relationship. When Shannon would post cryptically about challenges or difficulties, when there were signs of arguments or tension, the messages to the ex-girlfriend would intensify. It's a pattern that anyone who studied infidelity recognizes immediately, the secondary relationship serving as an escape valve, a place to retreat when the primary relationship required too much work or accountability or emotional presence. Maintaining 2 relationships simultaneously for 5 years isn't accidental or impulsive. It requires sophisticated compartmentalization and systematic deception that speaks to either profound psychological fragmentation or calculated manipulation, possibly both. The ex-girlfriend's account includes details about the mechanics of how this double life functioned practically, and they're chilling in their calculation. Different phones or apps for different relationships, ensuring that communication could be kept separate and risk of discovery minimized. Specific times designated as safe for contact, windows when she could expect responses because he wasn't with Shannon and the children, code words and careful language in messages that could be explained away as innocent if accidentally discovered, plausible deniability built into every exchange. meeting in locations far from their hometown where recognition was unlikely, choosing spots off the beaten path where running into someone who knew him was improbable, using friends as alibis and covers, constructing false narratives about his whereabouts that could be corroborated by people who either didn't know they were lying or had their own reasons for maintaining the deception. And throughout all of this, according to her testimony, there were periodic promises that the primary relationship was ending, that he was working on extricating himself, that she just needed to be patient a little longer and they could finally be together openly. These promises would be specific enough to seem credible. Timelines given for when he planned to have difficult conversations, explanations about why he needed to wait for the right moment because of the children or financial entanglements or filming schedules. It's the classic manipulation tactic used to keep a secondary partner invested. Maintain hope that their status will change while ensuring that change never actually materializes. The ex-girlfriend described cycles where she'd be told the end was near, would believe it, and stay committed, and then watch months pass with no movement toward the promised resolution. Eventually, she'd confront him about the delays, he'd have explanations about complications or reasons to wait a bit longer, and the cycle would reset with renewed promises and renewed hope. The strategic release of evidence suggests someone who'd been planning for this confrontation, who knew she'd need ironclad proof to be believed over an established public narrative supported by thousands of invested fans. The first wave was text messages from approximately 2 years ago, conversations that showed explicit romantic language and discussions of a shared future, making it impossible to claim they were just friends or that any involvement was ancient history. These messages reference specific events and situations, demonstrating deep knowledge of each other's daily lives, the kind of familiarity that only comes from sustained, intimate contact. Then came photographs that provided visual confirmation of time spent together, not intimate images, but pictures that told their own story about the nature of their relationship. There were birthday celebrations that he'd apparently attended with her, while his social media suggested he was elsewhere. Holiday photos showing them together during periods when the public narrative had him occupied with family obligations. Screenshots of FaceTime calls with visible timestamps that could be cross-referenced with his post and Shannon's posts from the same time periods, revealing the lies about his location or activities. Each release was timed to counter specific denials or defenses. When supporters would claim the texts could be fabricated, photos would drop. When they'd argue the photos could be old, messages with recent dates would surface. It was methodical and effective, systematically dismantling every possible defense until the only positions left were acceptance or willful denial of overwhelming evidence. According to the ex-girlfriend's account, this wasn't a complete secret. There were moments over the years when Shannon's suspicions were aroused, when inconsistencies or strange behavior prompted questions and confrontations. The documentation suggests at least 3 specific instances when Shannon directly confronted him about this particular woman, moments when intuition or discovered evidence made the secret relationship impossible to completely ignore. Each time, according to the timeline provided, he employed a tactic that relationship psychologists call DARVO: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. He'd deny anything inappropriate was happening, characterize the ex-girlfriend as just an old friend or someone from his past with whom he maintained occasional innocent contact, nothing that should concern Shannon or threaten their relationship. When pressed further, he'd attack, turning the confrontation around to make Shannon's suspicions the problem rather than his behavior. He'd accuse her of being paranoid, insecure, unable to trust him despite all he'd done for their family. He'd make the act of questioning him feel like a betrayal, positioning himself as the wounded party dealing with baseless accusations from someone who claimed to love him. And somehow, each time, the tactic worked. The confrontation would end with him reassuring her, recommitting to their relationship, perhaps making extra effort for a period to demonstrate his devotion, while the secret relationship continued quietly in the background. Think about the psychological impact of that dynamic playing out repeatedly over years. Being made to feel crazy or paranoid for suspicions that were actually entirely accurate. Having your instincts consistently invalidated and being gaslit into doubting your own perception of reality. It creates a situation where you stop trusting yourself, where you second-guess every concern because you've been conditioned to believe your suspicions are the problem rather than the behavior that triggered them. The ex-girlfriend describes her own internal conflicts throughout this period, moments where the weight of being complicit in someone else's betrayal became overwhelming, and she'd attempt to end the relationship and extract herself from the situation. According to her account, there were multiple breaking points where guilt overcame whatever feelings kept drawing her back, where she'd recognized that what she was participating in was fundamentally wrong, and that continuing meant compromising her own integrity. She'd cut off contact, block him on various platforms, commit to moving forward and building a life that didn't involve being someone's secret. But emotions aren't logical, and patterns are hard to break, especially when someone knows exactly which emotional buttons to push to draw you back in. He'd find ways to reach her during these periods of separation, using different numbers or mutual friends or new accounts, and he'd deploy the full arsenal of manipulation tactics to pull her back. He'd apologize profusely for taking her for granted, acknowledge that she deserved better, promise that things were actually changing this time, and he was finally taking steps to end the primary relationship. He'd love bomb her with attention and affection, giving her the version of himself she'd originally fallen for, making her feel prioritized and valued in ways that made the pain of being secondary seem worth enduring. And each time she'd come back, believing this time would be different, that the promises were real, that her patience would finally be rewarded. The relationship would be good for a while. Consistent communication, actual effort, plans being made, hope that circumstances were genuinely shifting. Then, inevitably, the cycle would repeat itself. He'd become gradually more distant, prioritizing the other life again, leaving her waiting for crumbs of attention while presenting himself as devoted and committed elsewhere. The gaps between messages would lengthen, plans would be canceled last minute, and she'd find herself back in the familiar position of being an afterthought, a secret, someone to visit when the primary relationship was stressful, but never important enough to actually choose. The children are the unavoidable elephant in this room. 4 innocent kids who are the true victims of whatever deception occurred, regardless of the adult's culpability or choices. Any responsible discussion of this situation has to center that reality and hold it with appropriate weight and sensitivity. The ex-girlfriend has stated explicitly and repeatedly that she never wanted to disrupt the children's lives. That part of her motivation for maintaining silence as long as she did was awareness that exposing the situation would impact kids who had absolutely no say in the adults' choices and bore no responsibility for the chaos. It's part of why, she claims, she gave him multiple opportunities to handle this privately, to come clean on his own terms, and manage the situation in a way that minimized damage to the children. She describes conversations where she urged him to tell Shannon himself, to take control of the narrative before it spiraled into public exposure, specifically because that would allow for privacy and protection that a public revelation couldn't provide. But there's a counter perspective worth considering, which is that those children were already being impacted even when the secret was successfully hidden. They were living in a home where one parent was emotionally divided between 2 relationships, where their daily reality was built on foundations of deception and lies. Children are perceptive even when they don't understand specifics. They sense tension, inconsistency, the feeling that something is off even if they can't articulate what. They were already experiencing the effects of living in a family structure that wasn't what it appeared to be, where one parent was performing commitment rather than actually providing it. The final straw that prompted the public revelation came approximately 2 months ago. According to the ex-girlfriend's timeline, during one of their periodic off phases when they hadn't been in contact for several weeks. She'd apparently reached a point of genuine resolve this time, committed to actually moving on and building a life that didn't involve waiting for someone who would never fully choose her. Then he reached out with a message that crystallized everything wrong with the dynamic they'd maintained for years. It wasn't an apology for the silence or acknowledgement of the pattern. It wasn't accountability for the ways he'd used and manipulated her. It was simply a message as if nothing had happened, as if she was expected to be available whenever he decided to reach out, regardless of how long he'd been gone or what had prompted his return. Something about that message broke through whatever emotional attachment had kept her tethered to the situation, despite all the evidence that it would never become what she wanted. The realization hit that this would genuinely never change, that 5 years of investment and patience and hope had been directed towards someone who had no intention of ever prioritizing her or being honest about what she meant to him. She'd spent 5 years being complicit in someone else's betrayal, compromising her own integrity, accepting a secondary position, and for what? For someone who clearly saw her as an option rather than a priority, a convenience rather than a commitment. In that moment of clarity, she made a decision. She would give him 2 weeks to tell Shannon everything himself, and if he didn't, she would. It was a boundary she'd never actually enforced before, despite threatening it in the past, and he apparently didn't believe she'd follow through this time either. He was wrong. When the first public post went live, the reaction was immediate, visceral, and sharply divided along predictable lines. Shannon's supporters mobilized instantly in defensive mode, flooding comment sections with accusations that the ex-girlfriend was a liar, a clout chaser, someone seeking 15 minutes of fame by trying to destroy a family with fabricated drama. They demanded proof, certain that none could exist because their preferred narrative, that Shannon and Josh had a solid relationship, couldn't accommodate the possibility that this woman was telling the truth. Some attacked her character, calling her desperate and pathetic for trying to insert herself into someone else's relationship. Others questioned her motives, asking why she'd come forward now after supposedly staying silent for years, suggesting that the timing itself proved she was lying or seeking attention. The ex-girlfriend appears to have anticipated exactly this reaction, because the proof started emerging in systematic waves, designed to address each objection as it arose. When people said she was lying about knowing him, she released messages that proved their connection. When they said those could be old messages from before his relationship with Shannon became serious, she released recent exchanges showing ongoing contact. When they claimed the messages could be fabricated, she provided photos with verifiable metadata. Each denial from supporters was met with another layer of evidence that became progressively more difficult to explain away. The timestamps didn't lie and could be verified independently. The metadata on photos was forensically checkable. The messages contained specific references to real events and situations that someone outside the relationship wouldn't have known about. And then came the voice message that may have been the most damning single piece of evidence released. His voice, unmistakably from just 8 months prior, telling her that he loved her, that he was working on figuring things out, that she needed to be patient, but they would eventually have their chance to be together openly. 8 months ago. Not 5 years ago, when maybe you could argue that circumstances were different or feelings had changed. 8 months ago, when the public relationship appeared stable and committed, when family content was being posted regularly, when by all external appearances everything was fine. The silence from the central parties in the 3 weeks since this exploded publicly has been deafening and telling in its own way, speaking volumes through absence. Shannon's social media, typically active with family content and updates, went completely dark. Josh similarly vanished from public view. No posts, no stories, no statements of any kind. And that silence is significant because it deviates dramatically from the typical pattern when false accusations emerge. When someone is falsely accused of infidelity, the normal response is immediate, forceful denial, threatening legal action against the accuser, providing counter-evidence that disproves the allegations, vigorously defending your reputation and relationship. Complete silence, particularly sustained silence over weeks, typically indicates one of two things. Either lawyers have advised against making any public statements while they assess legal options and exposure, or there's a recognition that the truth is so damaging that any statement would only make things worse or open the door to questions that can't be answered without admitting to things better left unaddressed. Meanwhile, the ex-girlfriend has continued engaging with people, providing additional context when asked, answering questions about the timeline and evidence, maintaining her account with consistency. She's not monetizing this situation or selling her story to tabloids. She's not doing interviews for payment or launching a social media career off the attention. If anything, she's subjected herself to massive scrutiny and harassment from people who are emotionally invested in not believing her because accepting her truth requires abandoning a narrative they've supported. The asymmetry of engagement is striking. One side providing detailed, verifiable information, and the other side providing only silence. Understanding how someone maintains two relationships simultaneously for 5 years requires looking at the psychology of compartmentalization and how certain personality types develop the capacity to essentially become different people in different contexts without experiencing the cognitive dissonance that would destroy most people. Psychologists who study patterns of sustained infidelity explain that serial cheaters often develop sophisticated mental separation between their different lives, creating psychological walls that keep their contradictory behaviors from connecting in ways that would force accountability. They're not constantly drowning in guilt or looking over their shoulders because they've learned to be fully present in whichever role they're currently performing. When they're with their primary partner, they can genuinely feel loving and committed in that moment, experiencing authentic emotion even though it coexists with behavior that completely contradicts those feelings. When they're with the secondary partner, they can similarly be present and emotionally engaged, making promises and expressions of feeling that seem genuine because in that compartmentalized space they are. The two worlds don't collide in their mind the way they exist in objective reality, allowing them to function without the constant psychological distress you'd expect from someone living such a profound double life. This is different from the popular image of a cheater constantly paranoid about getting caught, consumed by remorse, struggling with their choices. Some people develop such effective compartmentalization that they can navigate multiple relationships while sleeping soundly at night, their sense of self somehow remaining intact despite behaving in ways that seem fundamentally incompatible. It's not an excuse and doesn't minimize the harm caused, but it is an explanation for how someone could sustain this pattern for years without completely falling apart under the weight of their own deception. There's an uncomfortable question that keeps surfacing in discussions about this situation, one that doesn't have a clean answer. What is the other woman's responsibility and culpability in this situation? And at what point does she bear accountability for the betrayal, despite not being the one who made the original commitment? She knew he was in a relationship with Shannon. She knew there were children involved. She participated in the deception for 5 years, maintaining contact and intimacy with someone who was committed elsewhere, accepting a secondary position in a dynamic that required his lying to his family. This is where perspectives diverge sharply and often along gendered lines that reveal broader cultural beliefs about relationships and accountability. Some argue forcefully that she's equally culpable for the betrayal, that her choice to continue involvement despite knowing the circumstances makes her complicit in the harm done to Shannon and the children. They contend that claiming to be a victim herself while actively participating in someone else's victimization for years doesn't absolve her of responsibility for her choices. Others point to power dynamics and manipulation, arguing that she was likely subjected to the same compartmentalization and deception that Shannon experienced, fed carefully curated information and false promises that kept her invested in a situation that served his interests while harming hers. They note that the anger and vitriol directed at her often exceeds what's directed at him, following a familiar pattern where women are held to higher standards of accountability than men for the same man's behavior. The truth probably exists in the messy complexity between these positions. She made choices repeatedly over 5 years to continue something she knew on some level was wrong, and she was also likely manipulated by someone skilled at manipulation who used her feelings to keep her accessible while protecting his primary relationship. As internet investigators and social media detectives have dug into the available evidence, additional context has emerged that validates aspects of the ex-girlfriend's timeline and demonstrates that signs of this relationship were actually visible to anyone who'd known to look for them. People have found comments she left on his public posts from years ago that went unnoticed at the time, but now read very differently with context. Messages like, "You know what you mean to me," or "Can't wait to see you," on posts from periods when he was supposedly focused entirely on his family. Photos where she's visible in the background of images he posted, sometimes cropped out or positioned at the edge of the frame, but identifiable when you're specifically looking. Locations tagged in her posts that match locations in his posts from the same time periods, suggesting they were in the same places at the same times, despite no public acknowledgement of being together. There's also speculation, and we need to clearly label this as speculation rather than confirmed fact, about specific trips and absences that were explained as work-related, or time with friends but now appear to potentially have alternative explanations. Times when Shannon would post about him being away for work, and the ex-girlfriend's social media activity suggests she was with someone during those same periods. Times when his story about his whereabouts doesn't quite match the digital trail when you look closely. None of this is definitive proof on its own, but collectively it paints a picture of a relationship that had more touch points with his public life than he probably realized, visible cracks in the separation he thought he'd maintained between his two worlds. Shannon's extended family has been notably silent throughout this explosion, which is unusual given their typically vocal presence on social media and their history of commenting on family drama. Mama June, who has never been one to shy away from controversy or hold back opinions, hasn't made a public statement. Other family members who regularly engage online have similarly stayed quiet. This silence could indicate several things, none of them mutually exclusive. It might represent a collective decision to handle this privately and protect the children from additional public attention and scrutiny. It might reflect uncertainty about what's actually true. A recognition that jumping to defend before having complete information could backfire if additional evidence emerges. It might indicate that efforts are being made behind the scenes to facilitate whatever conversations and decisions need to happen away from public view. Or it might represent a level of chaos and conflict within the family that makes unified public statements impossible because people are processing different reactions and reaching different conclusions about how to respond. The ex-girlfriend has stated that her intention was never to cause pain to Shannon or the children, that her goal isn't revenge, but rather truth and the refusal to continue carrying the weight of lies that were never hers to bear in the first place. She frames her decision to come forward as ultimately being about self-respect and integrity after years of compromising both to protect someone who didn't deserve that protection. Whether you accept that framing or see it as post hoc justification for an action motivated by other emotions probably depends on your broader beliefs about privacy, accountability, and what's owed to whom in these messy situations. What makes betrayal of this magnitude so psychologically devastating extends far beyond the sexual or emotional infidelity itself. It's the retrospective contamination of every memory and the collapse of your ability to trust your own judgment and perception of reality. If Shannon genuinely didn't know the full scope of this, and there's been no indication that she was aware of a sustained 5-year relationship, she's now facing the task of recontextualizing her entire understanding of the past half-decade. That relationship she thought she had, built on trust and commitment and shared future planning, it never actually existed in the form she believed. The partner she thought she knew, who she defended against her own occasional suspicions, he was performing a role while living an entirely different reality that she wasn't privy to. Every moment that felt significant or meaningful now becomes questionable. Was he actually present or thinking about someone else? Were his declarations of love genuine or just lines he was performing? Was anything about what they built together real? Or was it all constructed on foundations of lies? That kind of betrayal doesn't just hurt. In the immediate moment of discovery, it damages your fundamental ability to trust your own judgment about people and situations. If you missed something this significant, something that was sustained over years, what else might you be missing? If someone could deceive you this completely while you lived with them and raised children with them, whom can you actually trust? It creates a crisis of confidence in your own perception that extends far beyond the specific relationship, making you question everything and everyone, because the most basic assumption that you can recognize when someone is being honest with you has been proven wrong. There's a unique cruelty to this particular betrayal happening to someone whose relationship has been documented on reality television and monetized as entertainment content. Shannon's life with Josh has been part of the show's narrative for years, with episodes featuring their family life, their challenges, their growth as a couple. Fans have literally watched their relationship develop, invested in their success, rooted for them through difficulties. Now, all of that content exists as a kind of evidence of the gap between performance and reality. Footage that takes on entirely different meaning when viewed with the knowledge of what was happening simultaneously off camera. Scenes where they appeared happy and connected become painful to watch when you know about the messages being sent to someone else during the same period. Testimonials about trust and commitment feel hollow when you understand that those words were being spoken while actively betraying the principles they claim to represent. This is the dark underbelly of reality television. The boundary between authentic life and performed narrative becomes so blurred that sometimes even the people living it can't distinguish between them. And audiences who've invested emotionally in these narratives, as if they're real, are forced to confront that what they were watching was at best incomplete and at worst deliberately misleading. Maybe he believed his own performance, and the version of himself he presented on camera felt more real than the secret life he was living. Maybe the cameras actually provided useful cover because they created a documented narrative that seemed to account for his time and attention. Or maybe it was all cynically calculated from the beginning, performing commitment for the cameras while doing whatever he wanted off screen, knowing that the documented public narrative would provide plausible deniability against any accusations. In comment sections and fan groups dedicated to the show, you can watch the real-time processing of betrayal by proxy as supporters who initially defended him aggressively now confront evidence and have to adjust their entire understanding of a relationship they thought they knew. It's a microcosm of the larger psychological process of accepting that someone you believed in, even from a distance as a viewer, isn't who you thought they were. Some supporters remain angry at the ex-girlfriend for disrupting the narrative they were enjoying, lashing out at the messenger because accepting the message is too uncomfortable. Others redirect that anger more appropriately toward the person who actually created this situation through his choices, recognizing that she didn't betray Shannon, he did, and her role was more complicated than simply villain or homewrecker. Some express feeling foolish for having defended him in previous comment section arguments, embarrassed that they vouched for someone who apparently didn't deserve that defense, angry at themselves for being taken in by a performance. And some, particularly sad to observe, refuse to believe the evidence no matter how overwhelming it becomes because they've invested so much emotional energy in the narrative they've accepted that changing their understanding would require admitting they were fundamentally wrong. So they dig in, claim everything is fabricated despite metadata and verification, attack the ex-girlfriend's character and credibility, find increasingly tenuous explanations for evidence that doesn't fit their preferred story. It's a reminder that sometimes we become attached to narratives in ways that make truth feel threatening, where protecting our existing beliefs feels more important than adjusting them to accommodate new information. Unfortunately, this specific story isn't unique, even though the particular details and people involved are. The pattern is depressingly familiar across reality television and social media platforms, where relationships become content and personal lives become brands. Reality television and influencer culture create powerful incentives to present curated, idealized versions of relationships because that content performs well and maintains audience investment. Couples who seem genuinely happy together, who are building something real despite challenges, attract loyal followers and sympathetic viewers. That creates pressure to maintain the performance, even when the reality behind it becomes rocky or problematic, because admitting relationship struggles feels like failing your audience and potentially losing the following you've built. When your relationship is literally content that pays your bills or provides your platform, authenticity becomes complicated in ways that don't affect private relationships. There's financial and professional incentive to stay together even when maybe you shouldn't, to perform happiness even when you're miserable, to present stability even when everything is chaos. And that gap between performance and reality creates space for secrets to thrive, because you're already maintaining one level of deception, pretending things are better than they are for the cameras, so additional layers of deception become easier to rationalize. We've seen this pattern play out repeatedly with couples across different shows and platforms. The influencers who seemed perfect in every video while privately barely speaking. The reality, stars who monetized their relationship while secretly seeing other people. The social media couples who documented elaborate date nights and romantic gestures while living essentially separate lives when the cameras turned off. The pattern teaches us that what we see publicly is always a curated version of a more complex and often messier private reality, and the more polished and perfect something appears, the more reason to suspect there's significant complexity being hidden. As this situation continues to unfold with no resolution yet visible, a central question emerges about what accountability actually looks like here and to whom it's owed. Is the public exposure itself the accountability, the natural consequence of choices that betrayed trust? Should there be public statements, apologies, acknowledgement of what happened? To whom is accountability primarily owed? Shannon as the primary partner who was betrayed, the ex-girlfriend who was manipulated and kept secret, the children whose family stability has been disrupted, the public who invested in a narrative that turned out to be false? Some argue vehemently that this is fundamentally private and should be handled privately, regardless of how public the relationship was before. They contend that dragging intimate details into public view helps absolutely no one and only intensifies pain for everyone involved, especially the children who didn't choose any of this. They see the public exposure as a form of revenge rather than accountability, motivated more by the ex-girlfriend's hurt and anger than by any genuine principle about truth. Others argue that when you've deliberately monetized your relationship through reality, television, and social media, when you've invited the public into your life and asked them to invest emotionally and sometimes financially in your narrative, there's a reasonable expectation of some level of accountability when that narrative is revealed to be fundamentally dishonest. There's probably validity in both perspectives. The children absolutely deserve privacy and protection from adult drama and the long-term impacts of having their family situation publicly dissected. But the adults involved made choices to live publicly, to profit from sharing their relationship, to build platforms based on their family life, and consequences of choices are rarely containable within neat categories. You can't selectively choose which parts of your life are public, claiming your relationship when it benefits you, but demanding privacy when things get messy doesn't quite work when you've already established that your relationship is public content. Assuming the evidence is authentic and the account is substantially accurate, Shannon faces decisions that are impossibly difficult with no good options that avoid pain. She has 4 children, years of invested time and emotion, financial entanglements through property and shared finances, and a public profile that makes private decisions automatically become public spectacles. Does she leave and disrupt the family structure despite the impact on the children? Does she attempt to repair something that's been so thoroughly broken and live with knowledge that will contaminate every future interaction? How do you weigh years of investment and shared history against the magnitude of betrayal? How do you make decisions that balance what's best for your children against what's necessary for your own well-being and self-respect? There are no good answers, and every option involves substantial pain. Staying means attempting to rebuild trust that's been systematically demolished over years, living with the knowledge of betrayal every single day, wondering constantly if it could happen again or if it ever really stopped. You'd have to find a way to move past the reality that he not only cheated, but maintained an entire separate relationship for 5 years, that he looked you in the face and lied repeatedly, that he made you feel crazy for suspicions that were completely accurate. Leaving means disrupting whatever stability exists for the children, facing judgment from people regardless of the choice you make, because you'll be criticized both for staying and for giving up, starting over financially and emotionally after investing so much of yourself. And all of these impossibly difficult decisions have to be made while millions of people watch and comment and judge and speculate based on incomplete information and their own projections about what they would do in a situation they've never actually experienced. For the ex-girlfriend who made the decision to come forward publicly, there's no victory or triumph in this outcome despite exposing the truth. She's subjected herself to massive public scrutiny and examination of her choices over 5 years. She's opened herself to hatred and vitriol from people who see her as a homewrecker, regardless of the circumstances or complexity of the situation. She's permanently attached her name and identity to a scandal that will follow her indefinitely, impacting her future relationships and professional opportunities. Every time someone searches her name, this situation will be what comes up. So why do it if the consequences are so significant and the benefits are unclear? According to her own statements, the decision ultimately came down to self-respect and refusing to continue compromising her own integrity to protect someone who didn't deserve that protection, to no longer accepting the role of secret and living in the shadows of someone else's lies, to reclaiming her own narrative after years of existing as a supporting character in someone else's performance. There's something meaningful in that choice, even if the execution and consequences are messy and imperfect. Deciding that truth, however painful and complicated, is preferable to continuing to participate in deception. Choosing to stop protecting someone who hurt both her and someone else while facing no real accountability for those choices. Whether that makes her brave or vindictive, or some complicated mixture of both, depends largely on your perspective, what you value most, and how you weigh the competing principles at play: privacy versus accountability, protecting children versus exposing lies, moving on quietly versus demanding truth be acknowledged. This situation is unfolding during a broader cultural moment of reckoning with accountability, particularly around issues of deception, manipulation, and the gap between carefully curated public personas and messy private behavior that contradicts the image being sold. We're collectively becoming less tolerant of the "what happens in private should stay private" defense, when that privacy was constructed through lies that materially affected other people who weren't given honest information to make informed choices about their own lives. There's growing cultural recognition that secrets kept to protect someone's reputation often come at the direct cost of someone else's reality and well-being, that the comfort of the person avoiding consequences for harmful behavior requires the continued discomfort and harm of victims staying silent. The ex-girlfriend's decision to come forward is part of a larger pattern of people deciding that protecting someone else's carefully constructed image isn't worth the ongoing cost to their own integrity and truth, that being called a liar or attention seeker is preferable to continuing to participate actively in lies. Whether this cultural shift is ultimately positive, creating more accountability for deception and manipulation, or whether it just creates new forms of public shaming and cruelty that cause their own harm, is still being actively determined. The shift itself is undeniable, though. We're less willing to accept that public figures get to selectively control their narratives without challenge, less willing to maintain polite silence about behavior that causes harm just because addressing it might be uncomfortable or messy. One aspect that distinguishes this situation from similar dramas in previous eras is the existence of comprehensive digital documentation, the receipts that make certain denials impossible to maintain, text messages that would have been untraceable phone calls in previous decades, photos with metadata showing exact times and locations that didn't exist before smartphones made everyone a photographer, digital trails through social media, Venmo transactions, location tags that create permanent records of where people were and what they were doing. The ex-girlfriend had the documentation to prove her account precisely because modern relationships leave digital footprints at every step. Every message, every photo, every transaction creates evidence that persists, which means maintaining secret relationships requires either avoiding digital communication almost entirely, basically impossible in contemporary dating culture, or accepting that verifiable evidence of your deception will exist somewhere and could potentially surface months or years later. This fundamentally changes the calculus of infidelity in ways we're still processing culturally. It's no longer just about whether you'll get caught in the moment through someone seeing you somewhere or finding a receipt. It's about whether permanent, shareable, verifiable evidence of your betrayal exists in forms that could emerge at any point in the future when someone decides they're done protecting your secrets. In some ways, this represents accountability through technology, making it harder to sustain deception when everything leaves a trail. In other ways, it creates new vulnerabilities where privacy is increasingly difficult, and the ability to genuinely move past mistakes is complicated by permanent records that can be shared infinitely. In all the analysis and discussion and debate about adults and their choices and accountability, we cannot lose sight of the reality that 4 children will grow up with the knowledge of what happened during this period of their lives. In the era of permanent internet archives where nothing truly disappears, they'll eventually be able to access every comment, every piece of evidence, every speculation and judgment about their family situation during a time when they were too young to fully understand what was happening. That's an enormous burden to carry, knowing that your family's worst moments are preserved as public record, that strangers have detailed opinions about your parents' relationship, that your childhood instability was entertainment content for millions of people. The adults involved all made choices that led to this moment and bear responsibility for those choices. The children made no choices and bear no responsibility, but will live with consequences anyway, possibly for the rest of their lives as this follows them through search engines and social media. While hopefully the adults in their lives are prioritizing their well-being and providing whatever support and stability is possible now, the reality is that damage from this period will likely echo into their futures in ways large and small. It's a stark reminder that our choices, especially in the age of social media and reality television, where private lives become public content, impact people who never consented to being part of the story and who will carry consequences they didn't earn. Despite the volume of evidence released and the extensive documentation provided, significant questions remain unanswered and may stay that way indefinitely. Was Shannon truly completely unaware of the full scope and duration of this relationship? Or were there acknowledgments and attempted reconciliations that happened privately and never became part of the public narrative? Were there other people involved beyond the one ex-girlfriend who decided to come forward? Additional relationships or encounters that remain hidden? What exactly was promised to whom and when? And how did those promises evolve over the 5-year period? Some of these questions may never have public answers, residing permanently in the realm of private knowledge, accessible only to those directly involved. Some may emerge gradually as the situation continues to develop and as people decide what they're willing to share or what they feel compelled to address. Some may remain contested, with different parties having genuinely different understandings of the same events, filtered through their own perspectives and emotional investments. What we know is sufficient to understand the basic structure of what happened, a sustained pattern of deception over years, 2 women led to believe different and contradictory versions of the same person's commitment, children caught in the middle of adult dysfunction, and now the painful process of truth confronting carefully maintained illusions. The specific details matter for understanding the complete scope and for those directly involved to process their experiences. But the fundamental betrayal is clear enough regardless of what particular questions remain unanswered or disputed. If there's anything constructive or potentially positive to extract from this painful situation, it exists in the possibility of what comes after the initial devastation, the potential for genuine growth and change when illusions are destroyed and reconstruction has to happen from a foundation of truth rather than performance. Betrayal of this magnitude destroys what existed before. But that destruction also creates space for something more authentic to be built if people are willing to do the difficult work required. For Shannon, recovery and moving forward means processing the grief of what she thought she had, working through the anger of being deceived so thoroughly, and ultimately deciding what kind of future she actually wants rather than what she thinks she should want or what others expect. That future might include him if he's willing and capable of doing the intensive personal work required to understand the patterns that led to this behavior and make fundamental changes rather than just performing contrition until things blow over. Or that future might mean building something entirely new without the weight of this betrayal, discovering who she is, separate from a relationship that defined so much of her adult life and public identity. For the ex-girlfriend, moving forward means integrating this experience into her understanding of herself, examining what, in her own patterns and beliefs, allowed her to accept a secondary position for so long, and building future relationships with clearer boundaries and stronger self-respect that doesn't compromise fundamental needs to maintain connection with someone unavailable. For him, if he's genuinely capable of it rather than just performing accountability, recovery means confronting whatever emptiness or dysfunction required, maintaining 2 relationships to feel whole, doing deep internal work to understand why hurting multiple people seemed preferable to being honest and making actual choices, developing the capacity for genuine empathy regarding the harm caused, rather than just regret about consequences. Stories like this function as cautionary tales on multiple levels for those willing to extract lessons rather than just consume them as entertainment. They remind us that social media presentations are always curated and edited, that relationships that seem perfect from the outside often conceal complexity or dysfunction that isn't visible in carefully selected photos and captions. They demonstrate that seeming stable and happy in public posts means very little about the actual internal reality of a relationship, since people have strong incentives to present idealized versions regardless of truth. They show that sustaining deception of this magnitude requires enormous ongoing energy and effort that could be directed toward building something genuine instead, that the work of maintaining lies is often harder than the work of being honest. They also remind us that truth eventually emerges, even when it takes years. That secrets of this significance rarely stay buried indefinitely because someone's conscience bothers them, or someone gets tired of being hidden, or someone decides their integrity matters more than maintaining someone else's lie. And they demonstrate that the digital age has fundamentally changed the nature of privacy and consequence in relationships. What might have remained private speculation or rumor in previous generations now becomes documented evidence. The receipts exist and are shareable. The gap between what you present publicly and what you actually do privately is increasingly difficult to maintain. Beneath all the drama and commentary and analysis and evidence are human beings experiencing real pain that exists regardless of whether it's being processed publicly or privately. Shannon is confronting the collapse of her understanding of her relationship and facing impossible decisions about her future while millions watch. The ex-girlfriend is processing years of being secondary and hidden while dealing with public attacks on her character and motives. The children are sensing adult chaos and disruption even if they don't understand the specifics of what's happening. And yes, even him. Watching his life implode publicly as consequences of his choices over years finally materialize, dealing with the reality that he hurt multiple people who trusted him, facing judgment from everyone who has access to the story. None of this erases accountability or suggests consequences are unfair. Actions have consequences, and these consequences are the direct result of sustained deception and manipulation. But it's worth maintaining awareness that even in situations where someone is clearly wrong and cause significant harm, they're still human, still capable of pain and regret, still someone's father even if they failed profoundly as a partner. The goal isn't to excuse or minimize the harm caused, but rather to remember that even in the most dramatic public scandals, real people with complex internal lives are experiencing this as lived reality, rather than just entertainment narrative. The suffering is real for everyone involved, even when some of that suffering is deserved consequence rather than unearned victimization. So here we are, weeks into a scandal that shows no signs of resolving cleanly or quickly, with more questions than answers about what happens next, and how the people involved will navigate forward from this point. A single screenshot started the unraveling, but the truth it revealed had been there all along, living quietly in the gap between what was presented to the world and what was actually real. For 5 years, two women existed in parallel universes, both believing different versions of promises made by the same person, neither with complete information to make fully informed choices about their own lives. Now the secret is public, spread across thousands of comments and shares and discussions. The evidence is overwhelming to anyone willing to look at it honestly rather than through the filter of preferred narratives. The carefully maintained performance has collapsed entirely under the weight of truth it could no longer contain. What happens next is still being written in real time, whether there will be reconciliation or separation, whether he'll take genuine accountability or continue deflecting and minimizing, whether Shannon will find the strength and support to rebuild whatever future she chooses for herself and her children, whether the ex-girlfriend will find peace in her decision to speak up, or will struggle with the consequences of that choice. But one thing has been definitively established. The version of the story we all thought we knew was at best incomplete, and at worst deliberately fabricated. And sometimes the most important and difficult thing we can do is stop defending narratives we want to be true and start confronting the messy, complicated, painful reality underneath them. The truth always finds its way to light eventually. Sometimes it just takes 5 years, comprehensive documentation, and one person who finally decides their integrity matters more than someone else's secrets. If this story resonated with you or made you think about the gap between public presentations and private reality, share your thoughts. And remember that what you see on the surface, especially in the age of curated social media and reality television, rarely tells the whole story. The performance is always edited. The truth is always more complex,